back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges and successes of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests get to share their successes and challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy with a primary focus of how they've overcome these obstacles and how these obstacles could have otherwise ended their journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally. Today, I'm joined by Daniela Lopez from AKQA. Daniela, thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me.
I know we're on opposite sides of the globe today. So yeah, thank you for making the time. I always like to get started by getting to know you a little bit, how you got exposed into the accessibility area and became the leader that you are today. So over to you.
Oh, good. Okay, so as you mentioned, I'm Daniela. I'm originally from Mexico City, and then I moved to Australia for university back in around 2007. God, a long time ago. Starting to get old. And then about a couple years ago, we decided to kind of move once more. So we moved to New Zealand, where I am right now, about 2.5 years ago. So here I am now. So my journey into accessibility was a little bit accidental. I don't know if I would consider myself a leader, more of an advocate, but it's one of those things.
Equally as important.
It's all good. But I guess I just kind of ended up here accidentally. I think my first job was in advertising and media, and then at some point I ended up switching jobs, and I got a job as a project manager or project consultant, I think is what they called it, at a digital agency. And I didn't even know accessibility was a thing. I had never actually been exposed to it until I actually started that job way back in 2015. And I was introduced to the world of accessibility, and I was just incredibly fascinated by it. I didn't even know those little bits and pieces and how it affected people, like the color contrast or, like screen readers. I had never actually been exposed to that world. So once I did, I became very curious about it. I'm very passionate about it. So, I kind of ended up learning and, self-taught myself, read things, ask questions, and try to kind of understand, everything about WCAG and, what is accessibility and all those little bits and pieces. And I just kind of became a very, very big kind of advocate for the accessibility world and for equality. I think part of it is also my mom's influence. My mom has always been a big advocate on equality, equity, and, making sure that we treat others and give equal opportunity. So I think that kind of rubbed off on me. And with accessibility in mind, I was just like, well, yeah, we should go into this. So that's always been a thing. And then I think it just became a stronger thing since I've been diagnosed with ADHD as well. So before I just considered myself an ally, but then now I just realized that I'm part of the neurodiverse or neurospicy community, as I like to call it. And it's just it just makes me a bigger stronger advocate for the whole thing. And I gotta thank my husband for realizing that maybe I have ADHD and maybe the pandemic, because he realized that I had it once he saw me in work mode and was like, oh yeah, no, you're hyper focused and have all the things. So that was really interesting. So I finally got diagnosed quite recently, and just being on meds, realizing that you don't have to cry every single time that you see a pile of laundry was really nice. Once you're actually on the medication, it's like, oh, okay, now we understand why you people don't freak out on it. So that's really good. But yes, I think that's been kind of my journey, and just learning self-taught things, and just being curious, reading, and trying to understand things.
Yeah. So you mentioned the upbringing of advocacy and inequality. How does that fit into your role today?
I think it fits quite heavily in the sense that I do consider myself someone that will speak up for others. Like, I will defend. I've got this big sense of social equality and justice, and I have gotten in trouble in the past, not in the current role that I'm at, but in previous agencies that I've been at and previous roles that I've been at. I have gotten in trouble for speaking up and, talking about, the problems that are happening, or talking about discrimination, or talking about all these bits and pieces. But, at the end of the day, someone has to do it. And if I'm going to get in trouble for, fighting for that, then I shouldn't be here. And, feel free to fire me. They never did,
Mm,
obviously.
yeah.
But, like they could try. So that was kind of the thing. And, like having that rubbing off on me from my upbringing with my mom always actually fighting for all that stuff, is kind of what made me not shut up about it. And just kind of learning how to like be an advocate. And, often it happens that, you sweep things under the rug. You don't realize that you're kind of encouraging a culture of inequality, or, of people shutting up, or, not saying anything. So, someone has to speak up. And when they realize like, hey, it's okay to speak up, I think you can actually lead with that example. And that's what's been happening. So it's just about being that ripple effect.
I was going to say that a little bit of the maybe the naysayers is almost the level of ignorance that has been acceptable in the lived, physical environment and the digital environment for so long, where lack of education, lack of understanding how to solve some of these challenges, which um kind of break it down to a little bit of ignorance, when it's like, well, not my problem, out of my purview of my responsibilities. And
Oh,
really,
yeah.
if you're,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you're right. Like, it's very much that whole thing of, I think there's a lack of education, but there's like a lack of empathy that only quite recently we've started wanting in our managers and our leaders. Like in the past, it was like, oh, if they're ruthless and, like, business savvy, and, they do everything for the finance and the bottom line, that's the leader that you want, not realizing that that's what was giving everyone anxiety and, like obviously making things worse. And I think quite recently we've actually stumbled onto empathy finally, which, you think it was obvious, but, here we are. But now we're finally demanding from our managers to know about empathy, to actually lead with a good emotional intelligence. And those soft skills have actually become a lot more and more important. And I think that's kind of helped with like driving some of that change lately. But you still have people that, are in that old school mindset. As you mentioned, there's a lack of education in there. But it's also like they were rewarded for being, and I'm sorry, I'm going to swear a little bit, but like, they've been rewarded for being assholes, right? Like it was a reward to be a dick. So at the end of the day, that why would I change, since that's what's gotten me so far? And now that it's not, they're getting like freaked out, and, we're challenging finally the status quo. And I guess that's kind of where it's all coming from.
Yeah. So about a decade of um working and lived experience within the accessibility space, how have you seen how vocal you need to be change over time? Is the conversation easier? Is it incorporated into a strategy playbook from the get-go now? How has your role changed in the level of advocacy that you need to bring um to what you deliver?
It has changed definitely quite a fair bit. I feel like we're becoming more and more aware of it. I mean, I think part of it is because all the lawsuits have become more and more, where people have become more and more aware of all the lawsuits, and at the end of the day, which sucks, but money talks, right? So if I'm going to lose money and, all of that, then, maybe I'll do accessibility. So I think all those successful lawsuits that we've had over time, all those case studies that we've had over time on accessibility have actually helped driving that conversation. Having governments driving the conversation. So, for example, the Australian government, I remember ages ago, made it so that all of the government departments had to comply with WCAG 2. I think it was 2.0 at the time. I think they only just updated to 2.1 if they have. But I think that was kind of like another driver, having, the government, saying like, hey, you have to do it to the government departments. But then private businesses didn't realize that it applied to them as well, that it was just government. So from when I started to where I'm now, I do see that people are more and more aware that they have to do it. They know how to ask for it. And they know that they need to do it. I think because there's more advocacy and it's becoming more and more obvious that it's a thing that you need to do, and it's not just government, it's for everyone, and that anyone can get sued. Ask Beyonce if you don't believe me, because she has been sued for accessibility. Um, well, not her, but her company, but
Yeah.
but like realizing that that is happening. I do see the conversation being a little bit better and people being more open to that, so I have to fight it a little bit less, but there's still a lot of work to do, because there's still some people that don't understand it, and unfortunately there's always that whole thing on, okay, but what's in it for me, what's in it for my business, what's the money, like, what's going to be the benefit to my bottom line, which is a shame, because you think that just not being a dick would be like a good um incentive. And sorry, I do swear a little bit, but like,
Keeps the conversation spicy. I guess if I could interrupt for 1 second, I think, the statement around the lawsuits becoming prevalent, I'm wondering if, you know, my personal take is the fines that are imposed on these conglomerates are fairly minor in nature, right? Like 75,000, 100,000, few $100,000 in fines. Is it somewhat viewed as the cost of doing business? And it's not that, right answer or wrong answer, but I'm wondering if the benefits of solving accessibility and creating better user experience is becoming clearer as a value and a need for the audience that you're serving, whether you're an e-commerce site selling product or a web app or any level of digital experience. For the leaders who are choosing to embrace it, is it just clear that it's a better user experience when you build inclusive designed products?
I think it's a combination. So, like, from the lawsuit point of view, I think that made people pay attention, because yes, there's some minor fines, but there are some big cases out there. Like, I think I remember there was one for Target that happened maybe back
Yeah.
in, it was early 2000s, I think. But like, I think Target got sued, and I think they got slapped with a $6 million kind of thing. So it was a big payout that they actually had to do. And Coles, even recently, that was in Australia. Coles is a supermarket in Australia, and they got sued for accessibility, I think was back in 2014. And they had already done a full redevelopment of the site. They didn't make it accessible. And the government was like, yeah, you need to make it accessible, dude. Like, you need to redo it. And yes, okay, it wasn't just paying a fine. It was just like they just spent millions of dollars redoing the whole shopping experience, and now they had to redo it again and spend another few millions. That's still a big bottom line. So I think those case studies do actually turn heads, or like, oh shit, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that business. And then
Yeah.
on top of that, there's the whole thing of realizing that, hey, accessibility helps everyone. And it's actually, and having that secondary bit, because now they're open to listening, so they got scared by the lawsuits, and now we're open to listening about the benefits. And now it's like, oh, wait, what? I've been missing 25% of my audience, and I can actually get more money. Okay, that's amazing. I didn't realize that I was, like losing 25% of my audience, right? Like, I can actually now reach these people. Or, yeah, so I think that's kind of like the main thing, like that turn heads and open their minds. And now we can actually have those conversations, and those benefits are like, hey, it's better for accessibility. And just teaching that a lot of the innovations that we know nowadays, and a lot of the stuff that we use these days that, like we take for granted, were actually accessibility innovations, right? Like text messaging was supposed to be for deaf users, like electric toothbrushes is for people with mobility limitations, like all of those bits and pieces that we now know on a day-to-day basis and we can't live without almost,
Yeah.
part of an accessibility need. And I think people realizing that accessibility breeds innovation and makes for a better user experience is what's opening the door. But I think the first turning point was like, oh shit, I'm going to be penalized. And now it's like, oh cool, I can make money out of this because capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious to know from your viewpoint, have you seen an effective way to measure the benefits?
Of accessibility.
Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate doing right and doing good by your entire customer base, but metric wise, how have you seen any good case studies there? The reason
um
I'm asking is I hear so much from a gap perspective in being able to tie it to, ROI and to metrics. But
Yeah, I think, well, that's a different conversation, right? The whole ROIs and metrics, and all of that, like, we're still haven't figured out how to quantify that probably in the accessibility point of view, like, this actually happened for accessibility. But I think
Yeah.
overall you can definitely see the benefit. Right. So we know that one of the accessibility guidelines might be make it in simple English or simple in your language, right? Make it easier to understand. So now out of the blue, people can actually understand what your product is doing a little bit better. They can understand what they're getting themselves into a little bit better. So therefore, you have maybe a little bit less complaints or maybe more of an uptake because people understand what your product does. There's also the whole part of a better user experience because you simplified it and made it less complicated for other users, to navigate your website or to find the information they need. That actually happens with the population. So obviously instead of, spending hours trying to browse and finally shop for something, it actually becomes quicker. So people actually come back. There was a statistic that I read that I think it was 69%, or maybe I probably don't quote me on this one, but there was a statistic on there was like a high percentage of users who had accessibility needs that would actually leave the website if it wasn't accessible. And it was like a very, very high number. So that's how many people you are losing. So there's something in there as well, but it's kind of hard to correlate it to accessibility because we don't know if they were using screen readers and, we haven't actually, apparently there's some ways to do it, but we still haven't made it a big thing on doing
Yeah.
that correlation. But I think there's like some soft things that we can realize that yes, there is a benefit to what we're doing and to inclusivity.
Interesting. So as you've advocated and implemented accessibility into your day to day and the strategy that you've developed, what are some of the challenges of reaching scalability and into managing the program?
I think the main one is the fact that, in a twist of irony, the WCAG guidelines are not accessible. So they're really great for, like, this is what you need to do. When people read it, it's open to interpretation. Everybody interprets them differently. And sometimes you're just reading that guideline over and over and you're like, I don't understand what this is saying. I don't really understand it. So, there's a big effort as a community to kind of translate what it means, like trying to figure out, in various steps, okay, well, what does that mean for me in a step? Like, does that mean that, something more tangible, something more implementable? So I think that's the first barrier to it, actually understanding what they mean. The
Mm-hmm.
second bit is same within the WCAG bit is just because it's WCAG compliant, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accessible. So, and I think people often forget that because there's a user experience that comes with accessibility. So a really good example with it is, does your image have alternative text? Yes, I added alternative text, therefore I pass WCAG. However, you didn't think of the nuance of, okay, but did you convey the right message in your image, right? Like, did you actually give the right description to it? Like, all those little bits and pieces. Like, yes, you got your tick, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your image, now because it has alt text, is going to be accessible. So I think that's like a big barrier to it. Just like really understanding and having that empathy and just understanding how to apply things.
Two things. It was funny. I was talking with someone earlier, and the discussion was around, would Gen AI help break down the barriers of providing contextual understanding of what is actually wrong? Because the YCAG rules and numbers don't translate well into everyone who essentially every person within an organization. If you were to pick the development group, right, they need to deliver a product from a development standpoint that delivers great experience and collaboration with the UX partners, right? But when they're moderating what are the accessibility issues, getting back a bunch of numbers and rules doesn't necessarily break it down in terms of, as a developer, how do I improve what I'm writing as code, right?
Mm.
And so I totally agree with I think the maturity that we need to see there, and you've hit the nail on the head because it's something that we're very passionate about at Wally, which is compliance and usability are two different spectrums. And I think you've had a lot of brands chase compliance for the last couple of years, and providers come into the space that it's like, we're gonna, slap compliance on your website, and then they're still getting in turn, lawsuits in the yes, they're compliant, but the usability is so low. So I would tend to agree there. How do you measure good user experience?
Um, in a simple bit, did a person want to throw the laptop or the phone out the window in a rage fit while using your site? There's a measure that I saw that's been happening lately, and I bloody love it. It's the rage clicks. Have you heard of rage clicks? Yeah, I love the whole rage click because it's like, see, this is how frustrating your website is because people are rage clicking because like that's how frustrating they're getting. I think there's a big part of it. The fact that people leave really quickly, there's like all those little bits and pieces that you can see. It's just the people living in frustration. Obviously, it's kind of hard to quantify with quantitative data. So obviously this is where, people that do my job in the research space, like you do a bit more qualitative stuff to kind of like show people evidence of, this is why they left, they almost like broke their laptops because they were so cranky with their website, or, they're not recommending it. You got to remember that, people are going to recommend things that they like, but they're going to really destroy if you actually messed it up. So, like I think all those things are in there. And just on a touch on that compliance, but like I think businesses need to stop caring. I mean, it is important to be compliant. That's, don't get me wrong, but I think it's more about what's the user experience and really kind of involved people with accessibility needs in the process. I think it's what's lacking at the moment. It's it's not about designing for people with accessibility needs, about designing with people for accessibility needs. Like stop excluding the accessibility community or disabled community, or whatever community you're talking to. Stop
Yeah.
excluding them for the process. We kind of want to be there, and a really good example of that is the accessibility overlays that have been built, like, which is that whole thing's like, hey, I've got the solution that's going to make you super compliant. You just have to install this little widget and you're going to be compliant. And now, like a year ago, and I think the letter's still circulating, the whole accessible community was like, no, those overlays are shit. Don't use them. They just make it frustrated. Creators can't use it. Like, you need to not actually implement those ones. Please, we condemn accessibility overlays. So that's just a really good example of doing the wrong thing, even if you're trying to do the right thing.
You hit the nail on the head. So I would love to know some of the right things that you've done, to the successes that you've had. Right, what are the major wins that you've been able to achieve in this area?
I think the major means for me has been more around the education space. At the end of the day, I'm not a developer, right? Like I understand, like I actually learned a little bit of code, like HTML, and just like very, very basic stuff, mostly so I could actually understand that developer side of the WCAG guidelines, like really understand, okay, what's the difference between a role or an area label and so on. And I still get a little bit confused at it, but it's just so I can actually get a better understanding. But what I found and what inspired me, I guess, into my successes was I once was talking to a developer, like this was ages ago, previous to, where I am, like in a previous role. And I was saying like, hey, it's really important that we do accessibility. That was back when I was first starting. And he was like, yeah, but like, I mean, how many people does it really affect? Like 5%, 1%? Like, do we really need to worry about it? And I was like horrified by it. Like, why can't you have this attitude? So then what that inspired me to do was develop a bit of a training module that focused more on empathy around accessibility over the WCAG compliance. Because, it's like, as we've been discussing, it's just a compliance bit, but let's bring the empathy, let's bring the emotion, and let's show people what this means for others, like let's show him in. So I think that's been my main success, training people that it's not just the role of the developer as well. Like accessibility is a team sport. At the end of the day, we're all responsible for making things accessible. The designers, the project managers, the strategists, we, even the content writers. Actually, a lot of content writers don't realize just how important them it is. We can make a website, from a technological standpoint, really, really compliant. But if you mess up the body copy, if you mess up the content side of things, then suddenly you're no longer compliant. But that's not really our fault. It's, you did, like, we all have a job to do in all of this.
Yep.
So this training manual I developed was very much about showing people this is how a screen reader works, and and I've got videos of blind people using the screen reader. Then I've got videos of people using, the zoom in functionality, the magnifier, and just seeing people, like being on the phone, not just that they've got it zoomed in, but they're basically here just to try to read it, like just kind of it's just the power of telling the story and really bringing that empathy that has finally made people understand things. Like in one of the training sessions that I had a developer telling me like, oh, this is great, I didn't realize, I thought we just had to make it keyboard accessible. Like now that I understand, I thought that we had to comply with these things, but now that I see how it works for a keyboard, how it does for a reader, like it just completely transformed my mindset into realizing how it works for a person. So now it goes from, I guess I need to meet this, to like, oh, this is why I need to meet it. This is the why behind it. Because as people, I mean, especially me as an ADHD patient, I'm a very contrarian little shit. So I won't do something unless I understand the why behind it. And I think using that logic of like, this is why it is, this is why it exists, and this is like the difference that you're making in people's lives, just completely shifts the mindset. And I think that's been maybe my biggest achievement, just being able to make accessibility more accessible.
Yeah, and the impact clear, right? Like that. What I'm hearing from you is that, showing firsthand experiences, that developer was like, oh shoot, this
Yeah,
has this has a real impact on people who are using the technology that I built.
absolutely. And it's just bringing that user experience lens, into that compliance and accessibility. And I think the other impactful bit was just, I don't like to talk about accessibility as being a thing about disability. I like to make sure that I like to point out that it's not a disabled thing, it's a vulnerability thing. And we can all be vulnerable at every point of our life. I mean, any accessibility expert will have used that whole spectrum of accessibility, which is, the permanent, semi, temporary, and situational, which is, the broken arm,
Yeah,
an amputee. And, we're all familiar with that, but that is just so powerful because it's just showing we can all be vulnerable at any stage of our lives. And that's going to have a thing. Just because you're not in the disabled community doesn't know that you won't need and you won't be vulnerable at some point in your life. And if we make, and this will benefit you in the longer term. So now you go from benefiting 25% of the world population to it actually benefits 100% of the world population, because we will all be vulnerable at some point of our lives.
you couldn't have said it better. I have to just say, Danielle, like the simplicity that you break down accessibility to is is perfect, because with folks that I talk to, oftentimes there's like this huge complex problem, right? And I'm kind of an opportunist, so it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. But the way that you've described the approach and the simplistic way of starting with the education and the impact, right, that you shared is, it's inspiring.
Thank you.
So, what I would love to know is what excites you about some of the disruptions that are coming, or maybe scare you, I guess, is if we want to put the negative spin on it. But what are the biggest disruptions coming to accessibility?
I think there's a twofold. There's a social disruption that is finally coming in and has been ramping up over the years. So more and more businesses are making those whole things about, campaigns around hiring neurodiverse individuals or neurospicy individuals. Like there's this whole campaign around dyslexia, and like all these celebrities that came out and advocated for dyslexia. Now dyslexia on LinkedIn is a skill out of the blue. Dyslexic thinking is a skill now. So there's like this whole social bit that we're becoming more and more advocates of, our own vulnerabilities. We've got things like TikTok or Instagram posts. Like I actually follow some really, really great um, so influencers in the disability space, and that's just helped me so much. I think Lucy Edwards, who is like a blind Instagram celebrity back in the UK, she's probably the first one I actually came across with, and I loved how she was educating people on her blindness. This is how I put on my makeup, and her makeup was flawless. Like how, wow, this is absolutely incredible. So her showing and breaking down the barriers, that was very, very useful. So like from that to where we are right now, where realizing that uh people that think differently, people that have different experiences are so important now as part of the corporate world, and can actually, and the business world. I think there's that social disruption that has been coming, which has been great, which was also exacerbated by COVID. the fact that, COVID actually, I think there's a statistic that I know from the US that, suddenly we have a higher employment rate from the disabled community than it used to actually be way back, before COVID, because suddenly you could actually work from home. So you didn't, have the social anxiety, or you didn't need to actually, go into a building that needed a ramp anymore, because you could actually have your own setup at home. So I think all those social disruptions are like really, really good. We're seeing more and more of advocacy. And I think a great thing as well is just celebrities in general just coming out and being like, yeah, I've got HDHD, I've got dyslexia. I mean, I've always used Zack Snyder as the perfect example of a celebrity that has dyslexia, mostly because my husband loves it and now I do too. But that's why all of his movies are so big visual masterpieces, and they're just amazing and impactful, and they have a lot less dialogue because of his dyslexia. He just communicates on a different level, and that's why we have like these beautiful, movies and, like visual elements in all everything that he does. My favorite fun fact is that he actually has someone that reads things for him, which is really good. I mean, even in Drag Race, I think it was maybe in the Canadian one, there was like someone that was dyslexic and was explaining like, oh yeah, I see words on a page and I just see them flying. So, how do I, get help in that? So, all that exposure has been really, really good. And, that whole, people coming out and, like I've got it and, not hiding anymore and in becoming. So there's that social disruption that I'm very, very happy with, that it's been ramping
Yeah.
up. It's, bringing that side of it. And I think the other disruption, which you would know, it's AI at the end of the day. And that's kind of exciting because it kind of makes it a little bit easier to doing some testing, easier to do a bits and pieces. The only scary bit is just remembering that we can never take the human element out of it. At the end of the day, AI is not going to replace our humanity. AI is not going to replace that. It can actually help us make things more accessible. It might actually help us make things a little bit easier, but you will always need the human element. It doesn't, matter whatever tools that you got your eye, nothing is going to replace having a blind user sitting down and trying to use your solution and telling you like, yes, this makes sense or that doesn't make sense. And that is so, both a good thing. AI is going to just make it a little bit simpler for everyone to implement accessibility and to have the tools. And even within the accessibility, like having, for me especially, for as an ADHD person, just being able to have ChatGPT, summarizing a document, that just makes it so much easier, because I get so easily distracted by things. Like it's like, oh, shiny, we're over there now. So having those tools has been like a really, really good lifesaver, having those AI bits to kind of help me out. But again, the scary bit is forgetting that there's a humanity behind everything, and to lose our humanity, in the process, is my scary bit.
I don't know that I could have summed it up better from the humanity aspect of how important that is. Amazingly, we've reached the closeout of the conversation. I feel like a part two is probably just so natural because we both are rather chatty. But I want to say thank you, Daniela, because again, the simplicity in which you've spoken about how to go about getting into accessibility, about how to actually pioneer it, and the emphasis on the humanity aspect of, let's not let the computers and robots take over this problem. It's still a human level problem that humans need to solve. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll close out with just letting everyone know that um, your wealth of information is always available. And thank you.
No, thank you for having me. This was really good.